guys, it's Teresa. Welcome back to my channel. So today I wanted to sit down and do a little video on the differences and similarities between learning Japanese and learning Chinese. I've been meaning to do this video for a while, but I wanted to wait long enough for me to have more experience basically with learning Chinese to properly give you all of my information. So if you didn't know or you're new to my channel, I studied Japanese for 3 years, of which I spent 1 in Tokyo as an exchange student. And about half a year ago I took up Chinese, so I've had 1 semester of studying Chinese under my belt as well, so keep that in mind. My Japanese and Chinese skills are very different in level, and so all I can really give you is sort of a first impression as of now, but I do think that it reflects pretty well the overall situation as to how the two languages relate, and I don't necessarily think that my experience going forward with learning Chinese is going to differ very much from the past semester. Yeah, that being said, I have a few points to talk about, so let's jump right into the video. So the question I probably get asked the most in my real life when people find out that I have both studied Japanese and am now studying Chinese is, are they very similar? And there's no easy answer for this question because in some ways they are and in some ways they are really not. So the biggest similarities between the two is definitely the characters. If you didn't know, the characters in Japanese are called kanji, which literally means Chinese characters because they have actually been imported from China. They were imported from China in I think about the 1st century and then needed to be applied to the Japanese language, which is obviously very difficult because Chinese is a non-conjugating language, but Japanese is. So just based on the Chinese characters, there isn't a way to kind of change the endings to fit the tense and whatever else. So they had to develop other characters that are derived from the kanji but aren't kanji, and they kind of use the syllables, and those are the hiragana and katakana. Their alphabets represent the same syllables, but hiragana are used to write Japanese words and katakana to write kind of transcribed foreign words. That was actually already further than I meant to go, but that's just to say that yes, there are similarities. However, since the 1st century, Chinese characters within China have changed a lot, particularly in the last century when they were simplified. I believe it was sometime in the 1900s, but I don't fully know. So the characters that they do use nowadays don't always look like the ones that had been imported from Japan. The exception is Taiwan still uses the original characters, but for the most part the Chinese we learn is sort of High Chinese of mainland China. I think it's Northern Chinese or something. So we use the simplified version, which doesn't always look very similar to the Japanese version basically and to the original Chinese one. But yes, you're definitely going to have a head start if you already know the characters in one of the languages, because it's much easier to learn the new ones, particularly because often you can at least sort of guess what the corresponding one is because they might look similar but not quite the same, so it's just easier basically. I find it also easier because I already have gone through hour-long studies of characters, and even though there were Japanese characters which aren't identical to the Chinese characters, I feel like my brain already knows how to learn them, already knows how to save them. I also know the way to write them already, so everything comes so much easier to me because I already have a concept of the characters in my brain. I know how best to learn them and to remember them and things like that, so it's definitely very helpful. I actually didn't mean to go into so much detail on characters. I was just trying to tell you that yes, there are similarities, and the biggest similarity is the characters. There's also similarities in terms of some words that might sound similar. If you don't know, the Japanese characters in Japanese also often have a Chinese reading of them that sounds similar to the Chinese word. So for example, shui means water in Chinese, and while it means mizu in Japanese, the Chinese reading of the Japanese kanji in Japanese is sui. So sui and shui, it's very similar. There's only one letter that's different, which is the H. So there's some similarities there, which again can be helpful to study, but I don't think it's similar enough to really kind of take the burden of learning completely away from you. The biggest difference, I would say, is definitely pronunciation. If you didn't know, in Chinese, pronunciation is critical to properly speaking and understanding people. There are 4 different tones in which a word can be spoken, and depending on which tone it is, it might mean a completely different thing. The tones are and ah. I hope I did that correctly. I don't know, my speaking lab teacher is gonna come for me if I didn't. Whereas in Japanese, if you pronounce a sentence in a completely monotone voice, you're probably right. There isn't anything like tones, there's definitely things like emphasis, and yes, there's a correct pronunciation, but it's much less critical to understanding and speaking correctly. In terms of grammar and word order, there are some similarities, but also some differences. Again though, because there are at least some similarities, I think that it is certainly 100% easier to learn one language if you already know the other. I'm obviously basing this assessment on my personal experience, so it might not be true for everyone, but I find that it really gave me a head start ahead of everyone else who started with me because I already knew Japanese. There's a few reasons for that, and I think that the actual similarities between the 2 languages is only a small part of it. I think that the biggest reason why it's easier for me is because I already knew how to learn characters, and they already have a set spot in my brain reserved for that. I'm not sure where I heard this theory, but it sounds very true to me, so I kind of believe in it, I guess. Basically, it is that if you learn a language that is completely, and I mean completely different from your mother tongue, that has nothing in common with it, your brain is going to reject it. Your brain is going to do everything it can to block it because it doesn't fit into any set patterns of language learning that you've already established. It changes the paradigm, it changes everything, and you need to completely relearn those structures and how the language functions. And I believe once you have done that with one language that is completely different to yours, a language that is then kind of similar to that one won't be as much of a stretch for your brain to learn anymore. I noticed this the first time I actually sat in a Chinese class. My brain didn't feel overwhelmed. My brain didn't feel like, oh my fucking god, what you're doing to me, this is so much gibberish, I don't know where it fits, I don't know what to do with this information. Even though there are so many differences between the 2 languages, still it already knew where to put each piece of information. I extrapolated upon that information based on information I knew about Japanese, kind of just guessing that it would be the same, and often it was. So I felt like the feeling for the Japanese language that I had already developed carried over pretty well into my learning of Chinese, which was such a feeling of accomplishment and like wonder at what my brain is even capable of. I do believe that I am in general quite talented learning languages. I pick them up fairly quickly, and I don't need to spend huge amounts of time to grasp certain concepts, but still I am 100% also crediting the ease with which I picked up Chinese with my already knowing so much of Japanese. It's obviously difficult to, generalize my experience and draw from this how it might be for you if you were to pick up one or the other, but I hope that that is sort of somehow motivating to those of you who already know one of the languages and are kind of like thinking about learning the other one, if you might, want to do it as well. Another question I get a lot is which of the 2 languages I believe is more difficult. Now, I find this question really hard to answer for exactly the reason I just gave you, which is that I have such a considerable advantage with learning Chinese now that it's not really a true comparison. I believe, however, that there are a few kind of objective points to be made about each of the languages and why they might be easier to pick up. As I just said earlier, the pronunciation is 1000% more difficult in Chinese than it is in Japanese. So if you're somebody who kind of struggles with picking up pronunciation in whatever languages you've already learned, maybe go for Japanese if it's like a 50-50 thing and you just like don't really care which one you're gonna learn. However, if you're not scared of the idea of learning a difficult pronunciation, I think there might be some things that actually speak in favor of Chinese as a more easier language to pick up. One of them is that the characters that are used in Chinese usually only have one single meaning. maybe two, but it's rare. So most of the time they will have one meaning that you can learn, and you will forever remember that one character with the one word, and they will be, you know, forever linked in your brain. However, in Japanese, we have at least two pronunciations or like meanings, words that correspond with each character. The reason is what I just said earlier, that there is always a Japanese and a Chinese reading of a Japanese character. So you have to learn at least double the amount of syllables or words to remember for each character, which is a lot. Adding to that is that there's sometimes more than two. They might have 5 Chinese readings and 3 Japanese readings. It happens, it does. And the Chinese readings are often all the same. They are very similar, really hard to discern, really hard to distinguish between, and it's just a mess to learn. The light at the end of the tunnel is that usually is learning that you do for a specific exam, and as you progress through your Japanese learning, you probably will, actually you definitely will forget a lot of that. I have forgotten a lot of that. So in real life, based on my experience, those are usually gaps that you can fill quickly in your daily use of the language by using a dictionary, or just because your brain will randomly remember the reading again if it shows up in a meaningful context. So I wouldn't let that kind of deter you from picking up Japanese because you think like this is impossible to learn. Definitely use like flashcards and other things. I have a video where I talk about tips for learning Japanese, so if you wanna check that out, I will link it. But basically, it's a hurdle, but it isn't insurmountable. Another point that would be a little bit more in favor of Japanese, in my opinion, is that when you're learning Japanese, you are allowed and able to use hiragana and katakana, or actually mainly hiragana, as a crutch for a long part of your Japanese learning journey. I don't know how other courses are structured, but we learned hiragana and katakana at the very beginning. We had like 1 month to learn it all, and it was fairly simple because it's kind of like an alphabet, but with syllables. So kind of easy to remember. And you can then use that to basically write every single Japanese sentence that exists, because you can just transcribe it into hiragana. Japanese people will understand you, maybe. I will say it's really hard to read a text exclusively written in hiragana, but it's not impossible, and you can get a pretty long way with that. So Chinese, you don't have a Chinese transcription. You have pinyin, Hanyu pinyin, which is kind of a transcription but with Roman letters, so with English letters, whatever. But I can't really speak to the Chinese ability to understand that or to read that. I really don't know. I don't have any information on this topic, so maybe they will be fine with it. But in terms of classes, you don't obviously have to learn that script, and you can't really use it within a sentence. In Japanese, for example, if you write a sentence and you know a few characters but you don't know others, you'll just write the characters you know and then write the ones you don't know in hiragana. Whereas in Chinese, you need to write every sentence completely in Chinese characters or in Hanyu pinyin, but it might not be understandable to many people. So that means that when you start your journey of Chinese learning, you will be bombarded with new characters that you need to immediately learn. In our case, we didn't even have any sort of course as to like where people were teaching us how to learn characters. What is the best method of memorizing them and learning them? They would just tell us to repeat writing them all the time, all day, every day. And I mean, again, I had a huge advantage, so I didn't need to do this. But I felt for my fellow classmates because I was sitting there, and on the first day we were like, there's like 15 characters that you need to know until next week. And I was like, well, I think we learned that many characters in our first month, and here they want us to do that in a week. And the reason is obvious, because you need them for everything. So again, there's pros and cons to both in terms of how easy they are to learn, but I definitely think that both of them are doable if you're diligent and if you're interested, most importantly, and if you want to learn. So finally, I just want to touch on something that I also kind of think about sometimes, because I have experienced this with other languages, and that is confusing languages while you learn them because they're too similar. I did this when I was in school and I was learning Spanish and French at the same time, and even though I was ahead in my French studies by 1 year, there was the time when we did the same topic in both languages, and I think it was something like clothing or shopping or something like that. And then when I had an exam and I was trying to think of a specific word in French, I couldn't tell if the word that came to my mind was French or Spanish, so I actually used sometimes Spanish words in French essays without noticing because they sounded too similar and my brain was too like confused by learning both at the same time because they are very similar, if not in pronunciation but in everything else. So when I went into learning Chinese, I was worried that that might happen again, and this fear turned out to be only partially warranted. What definitely happened at the beginning is that my Japanese got the fuck out of my brain. I did expect this to happen because obviously your brain will only retain like information in your like active memory that you are currently using, and the one that you're currently using is gonna be more fresh and at the forefront, and everything else is just like getting in the back because we don't need that shit right now, right? So when I was trying to think of a Japanese thing or word, the Chinese word would pop up probably 90% of the time. And when I would see a character that I had learned both in Chinese and in Japanese, I would also think of the Chinese word because again, I was actively studying that while not really doing anything with my Japanese. However, what I did notice and what made me really happy is that anytime I would try and read a Japanese sentence, a full sentence with also hiragana in it, a full sentence with many different characters, my brain would instantly switch back to Japanese. I never once read a Chinese word in a Japanese sentence, even if I knew the character also in Chinese. So that gave me so much joy and so much hope because, again, I am just in awe of my brain and of human brains in general. Like, how crazy is it that my brain knows in what situations it should access my Chinese knowledge and in which it should access my Japanese knowledge, even if the characters are the same. I'm like, fucking amazing. Really amazing. I'm so impressed. Not with myself, but with the existence and like the capabilities of the human brain. And then I tentatively tried to read a few Japanese books. Again, kind of worried that it might negatively impact my Chinese studies, but because my Japanese and my Chinese skills are very far apart at this point, I don't necessarily think that that was a real threat, and I ended up being quite comfortable reading Japanese texts, even though it took a while for my vocabulary to come back, but that is always the case when you don't interact with a language and you don't think about the words. So if you want to be on the safe side, I think it's definitely a good idea to learn them far enough apart for one of the two to have at least developed into a stage where, first of all, if you don't interact with the language long enough, it won't completely fade away. You will have all that knowledge still preserved in the back of your mind, at least most of it, for whenever you want to access it. And also until you are far enough apart for the topics that you might be thinking about or reading about or handling to be different enough that there won't be any topical overlap, because I think that's the most dangerous part, basically. And yeah, that is it for what I have to share with you today. I hope you found this video interesting and maybe informative. Please leave any further questions or comments you have in the comments down below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more videos every Tuesday and Friday. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you very soon with another video. Have a lovely week. Bye!